Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. We'll try to make the slides work also, but if they don't, I'm just going to talk to you anyway. So, and I do appreciate again this. We've gotten done a lot of work with the Committee on Education Labor. I know one of the staff is there today, so I want to thank them for all the oversight they've done on this. I think our effort would not have been possible without Chairman Miller requesting us to get involved and do this work. So a lot of kudos to them and Michael Zoll and some of the other people we dealt with on the committee. I'm going to go through a couple things with you today. I'll give you a brief background of my unit just so you know what we do. And then I'm going to talk about some of the work we did on the what resulted in two testimonies before Chairman Miller and his committee, one in October 2007 and the other in April of 2008. And talk a little bit too about some of the deceptive marketing work that we looked at as part of this. Okay. FSI is kind of GAO's tip of the spear, if you will, related to issues of fraud, waste, and abuse. I mean, most of the hearings I do on Capitol Hill relate to matters of fraud, waste, and abuse related to government programs. But more and more we get into what I would call special investigations along the lines of what we did here, and in particular when we did the undercover phone calls to the various programs posing as fictitious parents with kids. That was more in line with the traditional work that we would do. But you see we do forensic audits, we do special investigations, and we do security vulnerability assessments, such as taking improvised explosive devices onto aircraft. So this is a little different than that also, but it is some of the kinds of work that we do. We've also got a hotline I'll mention that we use where we get tips on fraud, waste, and abuse government-wide, and that's something we use on many of the investigations we do. As I mentioned, we had two separate investigations we did here. The first one resulted in me testifying at the hearing on October 10, 2007, which, by the way, was my birthday, actually. So it was, I won't say it was the happiest birthday. I think there was a lot of tears at that hearing, and it was a very moving hearing for me, one of the most intense hearings I've been to, from the standpoint of just the emotion of the parents. I know some of them I've seen here today speaking at that hearing. It was very touching to me, and hopefully we contributed to that in a positive manner. The objectives of what we did are up there on the screen. There were really three. I'm combining them from the two investigations. The first one was to look at whether or not there were widespread allegations of issues here. And as you know, there weren't really good sources of information necessarily to determine, are there thousands, tens of thousands, how many programs are there? So that was one of the issues, but we were able to, I think, answer that question to some extent. We did case studies of some of the programs, and some of the kids either died or were abused at these programs. And then as part of the April investigation, we did the undercover calls, which got into the issues of deceptive marketing. With respect to that first objective, and as many of you were well aware, we became well aware, there are thousands of allegations and issues out there of abuse and death related to these private residential programs, if you will, the boot camps, wilderness programs, etc. We found evidence of at least 48 of the 50 states having these types of programs. They may not still be around, but at some point in time it appears at least 40 had these programs, so it's fairly widespread. Whether that's still true as we speak today, I don't know, because I always imagined at some of those hearings that if I was a parent and had one of my kids at one of those programs, I'd have been in the car that day and I'd have my kid out of that program. So I wonder if that has actually reduced some of the business out there. I don't know. And then the Health and Human Services also had some information out there indicating that there were potentially thousands of issues. With respect to the specific cases, over the course of these two testimonies we provided to Chairman Miller, we had 14 cases of death we looked at and 4 cases of abuse. And these ended up being in programs across the country. And I did hear part of the last panel, and so this first issue is of no surprise to anyone here, untrained staff. That was a common theme throughout these, whether it be people claiming to have medical backgrounds or prior backgrounds with kids, or, as was mentioned, we found issues where people didn't have any background checks done and they had prior issues. So those were all the kind of things that we identified. And again, we couldn't project this with these 18 cases, but it appears that these are likely systemic issues that were out there. Lack of adequate equipment tying to this overall negligent operating practices of these programs. And I'll talk about an example of that with one of these cases I'm going to mention here briefly. Lack of nourishment for the kids, and again, I think I heard some of that with the last person that spoke here, and that happened for several of the kids that we looked at. They were starved in many respects, forced to do long marches and hikes in very extreme weather, or to be out in the cold without a blanket at night and yet not being fed any food. So those are, you know, I would call that a torture type of situation. Failure to comply with state licenses, bad advice on health problems. I mean, that was really very common across these, where these were treatable conditions that had appropriate medical attention been provided early in the process. Many or most of the 14 deaths we looked at could have been prevented. And then I mentioned the misleading information, I would call it deceptive marketing practices of these places, and I'll talk about that, but that's the kind of work we do very often, where we pose as fake parents with fake kids, and we call a lot of these places, and you know, if you go to them and say, hey, we're GAO, tell us about your program, versus if they think you're a parent that's got a credit card that works or you got money to pay for the program, you get a whole different answer, and that's why we do that kind of work. With respect to the deceptive marketing, we did find some fraud and false statements. The first one, and again, we didn't know what to expect, but the tax issue. They told our fictitious parents that the tuition payments were in fact tax deductible. And based upon our discussions with the IRS, that's not true. And so we had that from several of these programs. Misrepresentations about the psychological care of youth, educational credentials. Are these going to be high school credits that can be transferred, for example? And then the admission, policies. That's a very interesting one. We talked to one program, and they claim to have very stringent policies for letting kids into the program. Background reviews, interview the parents, interview the child. Well, the next thing we know, we didn't apply, we just called and talked about the program. The next thing you know, they sent us an acceptance letter in the mail. So their policies weren't obviously so stringent. They assumed we had money to pay, and they sent us a letter accepting our kid that hadn't even applied. And then the undisclosed conflict of interest, and I'm going to speak about that case specifically. I'm just going to talk about 3 of these 18 cases that we did, but again, some of the themes I just spoke of you'll see in these cases. The first one was a 15-year-old female in a Utah wilderness program. This goes back to 1990. Our cases spanned the years 1990 to 2007, so we crossed over about a 17-year period. Again, exhibiting some signs of illness for several days, throwing up water, falling down, blurred vision, apparent dehydration, but again, not treated in a proper manner, in a timely manner. The actual survival experts had gotten lost. They had wandered into a different state, and they didn't have radios with them, so they had to send smoke signals to call for help. And you know, this girl eventually died, and it took 18 hours for help to arrive. So I think that, as I recall, these highly trained experts, their credentials were whitewater rafting experts, actually. The second case was a 14-year-old male enrolled in an Arizona boot camp. Again, I mentioned forced to be outside in over 100-degree weather. Delirious, dehydrated, eating dirt, ultimately vomiting dirt, defecating. I mean, and they took the kid finally to a hotel, which at that point could have potentially helped the kid with proper medical attention. Instead, put him in the shower or the tub, watered him up, let him, again, they threw up, defecated again, eventually put him back in the back of a pickup truck, took him back to the camp, and I believe they died in their sleeping bag or shortly thereafter. And again, you see the nutrition issue here. They were fed, I guess it was 1 apple, a carrot, and a bowl of beans for dinner. So they were given very few calories, yet they were exhibiting certain signs and forced to stand outside in extreme weather. And the third case is an abuse case. The first 2 of our 14 death cases. One of our abuse cases was a 17-year-old male in a Mississippi faith-based academy or a boot camp. This child had attempted suicide, jumping off a building, breaking an arm. They had no medical attention for 2 weeks with the arm, and instead they were harassed and beaten, at one point unconscious. And an interesting part of this, but sad, is that the, quote, drill instructor had a pit bull that was trained to bite people in the crotch on command, and this kid suffered from that also. The deceptive marketing, just a couple of examples of that. The first one had to do with health insurance, and the program said, you know, these costs, which are potentially, as you know, tens of thousands of dollars, might be covered by health insurance.